Greetings, 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 and here we are again. Whoa, how time flies. It has been a wonderful festive season. I believe you are still in good shape because we are continuing with a whole new series. Wow, I can't wait to delve deeper into more historical oriented but theologically profound discoveries. I promise you, this particular series will be a lot of discoveries, and I can't even wait to start our first lesson. I believe you have been fine. I want to welcome you once again to Steady Insights and the whole new year 2026. I believe you've made a lot of resolutions, and I believe at least one of those resolutions is to learn and discover for yourself that which will guide your steps, even in our world today. And that is why we are here to study, to discover, and not just follow doctrines, not just follow scientific discoveries, but juxtapose them to real happenings and how they can be utilized in our lives. In this season's set of presentations, we will be discovering the significance of heaven and the earth. And we'll be looking at this from the lenses of two quite important books in the Christian world within the Bible, Philippians and Colossians. Are you ready? Let's delve in. I know you have been following a lot of stories in the Bible, but I want to promise you that this season's set will give you a better picture about what it really means to know some of the cities and even some of the people in terms of archaeology in the Bible. In the ancient world, imprisonment meant silence. If you were a prisoner, you did not write manifestos. A chained man did not shape civilizations. But as we will discover, somewhere in the first century Rome, under the watchful eyes of the most powerful empire the world had ever known, a man sat chained to a Roman soldier. And from that confinement, ideas were released that would outlast Caesar himself and even outlive the empire and even reshape heaven-earth relationships forever. Well, before you get confused, as we usually do, just stay tuned. Rome, as we have learned from history, believed that chains ended movements, but God turned chains into microphones because Paul's imprisonment was not a pause in God's mission, it was a strategic relocation. And this lesson will open not with freedom, but with confinement, not with triumph, but with tension, because, as we will discover, Christian history does not advance despite suffering, but often through it. Well, it brings me to a very important state, and that is remembering a particular quote according to the book of Philippians chapter 4 verse 4, where we are told, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice." But you would ask yourself, who is even the author, or better put, the writer of the epistles? It is a prisoner with a global mission, someone in the person of Paul. And as we will delve deeper, we will be looking at who Paul really is, being a prisoner, how he termed himself as an ambassador in chains, and of course his audience, the history of Philippi, the history of Colossae, and the churches within these two important cities. Let's delve deeper. Who really is the writer, or at least in the human sense, the author? Of course, clearly, it is Paul we are speaking about. By the time Paul arrived in Rome around AD 60, the city was the nerve center of the known world, and history confirms this, that even roads radiated from it like arteries. Laws issued from it governed millions. And we know perfectly that Rome controlled bodies, but God was about to capture minds. Well, Paul had newly entered Rome. Well, of course, he being a Roman and a Jew at the same time had some privileges. But there was a problem. Paul was not thrown into a dungeon. And even the Roman legal records and acts confirm that he lived under house arrest. I used to ask myself what house arrest really meant, because I could find in the very annals of certain countries that some presidents who had been ousted were put in house arrest. Well, Paul had already gone through that ordeal. And we are told that that arrangement, that house arrest, was common for non-violent people who appealed to Caesar, unintentionally creating a rotating audience of Roman troops. You could see Paul in house arrest being attended, well, not friendly, by Roman guards. And it's not just any Roman guards, it was the Praetorian Guard, where history tells us that it's Rome's most loyal, disciplined, and politically powerful military unit. They were Paul's unwilling congregation. So when Paul says, "My chains in Christ have become evident to the whole praetorium," in Philippians 1 verse 13, it was for a particular reason. He wrote to enforce that Christianity entered the heart of Roman power, not by force, but by proximity. From here, he wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, and a now lost letter to Laodicea during this period. Epistles born not of comfort, but of confinement. And that brings to mind another important picture as I go through this very critical phase of the lesson, ambassador in chains. Do you know that in Roman culture, an ambassador represented imperial authority? Well, hear me out. Paul redefined diplomacy. Though bound, he called himself an ambassador in chains. Well, what is this really meaning? This is more like a paradox. Because it does not only make sense when heaven's values collide with earth's systems. Paul had been in prison before, and that is noteworthy. In Philippi, in Jerusalem, in Caesarea, and likely many times which have not been documented. Yet, he refused the victim narrative. He does not use imprisoned, but he uses still a very renowned term, an ambassador. He refused the victim narrative. He framed suffering as a theological ground where divine strength is perfected in human weakness. So you can see clearly that Rome intended isolation for him, but God engineered multiplication. This is a clear lesson, especially for many people who find themselves in very unfriendly situations and use that as excuses never to do that which is right. Paul brings to our clear understanding that even imprisonment should be an opportunity of service. Well, then who are the recipients we are talking about here? First of all, since we spoke about Philippians, let us quickly look briefly to the history of Philippi. Before then, you understand in Acts 16, verse 9, that Paul had received a vision. Of course, Philippi was really not where he was going at first. We are told in a vision, Paul had been commanded. In fact, it was really a man who begged him to come over to Macedonia and help them in a vision. So it is perfectly understandable that clearly Paul's initial plan had changed. Well, let us quickly look at some of his journeys, even within those times. And I would like you to follow critically with the map and the legend on the screen. You see, there was a town in Phrygia. In fact, according to Acts chapter 16, Paul had traveled to Phrygia. He also went to preach in Galatia. He moved on to Mysia. Well, it is noteworthy that in Galatia he had opposition and he was unable to preach there. In Galatia, nor in Phrygia. Well, when you move on in the trajectory of his preaching, again he tried to go to Bithynia, but he couldn't. It happens that Troas was where he had that vision. And per the map, he went to Phrygia, Galatia, Mysia, Bithynia, and none of them was able to receive his message because that was not where he was meant to be, at least in the context of divine direction. Now he sailed to Samothrace, according to verse 11a, and here we are told he moved on to Neapolis. About 7 different movements coming up spontaneously. Finally, Paul arrives in Philippi. Now, it is noteworthy for me to tell you that Philippi was no ordinary city. It was founded as a Roman colony after the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. It was populated by retired Roman soldiers loyal to Caesar. Its citizens carried Roman citizenship by birth, and you can know, if you're a lover of history, that this was a rare privilege. Yet, surprisingly, when Paul arrived, there was no synagogue, and I could really much understand why he was being encouraged to go there. So Paul did something revolutionary. He preached to women by a riverside. And from that gathering emerged another prominent character, Lydia, who was a businesswoman dealing in purple cloth, a luxury dye reserved for elites. The gospel entered Europe not through palaces, but through prayer and hospitality. Well, something happens. There and then, public beating goes on, Paul is imprisoned, and there is a midnight worship. And from a Roman jail came an earthquake, not just geological, but spiritual. The jailer's conversion marked Christianity's irreversible entry into Europe. Wow. What a testimony. Paul is really going through a lot. But out of this, we see how powerfully, even in tumultuous times, the gospel was being spread. Now we can proceed to the history of Colossae. Well, you may have never realized that the names of Philippians and Colossians are actually stemming from the root words Philippi and Colossae. Historically, we know that Colossae was a smaller, less politically prominent yet spiritually vulnerable. And we can confirm from the annals of history that it was situated near Laodicea and Hierapolis. It sat at the crossroads of Greek philosophy, Jewish tradition, and Eastern systems. Frankly, Paul never visited Colossae. It was rather through a very significant instrument, Epaphras, who used to be, or should I say, was Paul's companion during his imprisonment in Rome. And he happened to be a native of Colossae. In fact, he is the one who introduced the gospel to that city. He was a local believer. Archaeological evidence confirms that Colossae had declined after earthquakes in the first century, and it mirrored Paul's concern that the church might collapse spiritually under false teachings. The important thing is, Paul did not condemn them, but he was very Christological. In other words, he utilized the methods of Christ in the purest of clarity. Why then don't we move quickly into these churches that were found within these cities? Remember, Paul is still speaking to them from prison. He addresses the believers as holy and faithful. And this is not merely because they were flawless, but because they belonged to Christ. And it brings to mind the power that we all, especially believers, who may have different flaws or different degrees of flaws, are so endowed with this privilege. We are so endowed with the opportunity to be called holy and faithful. So it's no surprise. In fact, the introductions to the letters to the Philippians and to the Colossians are very similar. And they show these two important aspects. That in God's eyes, church members are holy and faithful by virtue of the righteousness of Christ. Church members are bathed, especially through baptism, to be holy and faithful. And it doesn't matter their mistakes. And here is the most important point. This does not justify continued sinning. No. But in the eyes of God, by virtue of Christ's righteousness, the believers were holy and faithful. Secondly, in the church, Paul depicted a very important systemic way of doing things. In fact, in his address, he showed that there is an order where some of the members have more authority and responsibility. How does he do this? Paul is an apostle, and that is why he was the epistle writer. He's the top level leader. He is followed closely by Timothy, his collaborator, who in this current jurisdiction would have been a pastor, a keeper of the flock. Then the bishops, who happen to be the local elders, were also recognized. The deacons, more importantly, were the direct connectors to the church, to the people, and they were within this hierarchy of authority. You see, even in the context of mission, in the context of church, authority flows from service, not status. And that is what many people ought to realize and acknowledge. People in the church need a systemic way of doing things. However, the position endowed to people are showcased in their service, not their status. A very important point. As we move on, it becomes very clear that Rome believed Paul was contained. In fact, Philippi thought that the troublemaker had left. Colossae wrestled with ideas that threatened to eclipse Christ. Yet, from a rented Roman house, watched by soldiers sworn to Caesar, letters were streaming out almost all the time. Letters that proclaimed the power of Christ being the mediator between heaven and the earth. Paul's story teaches us that God's mission is not limited by geography. Chains do not silence truth. The gospel advances most powerfully when earthly power believes it has won. What kind of Christ is powerful enough to unite heaven and earth, and humble enough at the same time to suffer for it? And this is where we will go next. I believe you are ready.